Continuing Artaxerxes from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Making therefore his first appearance, all on a sudden, at the head of 900,000 well-marshalled men, he so startled and surprised the enemy, who, with the confidence of contempt, were marching on their way in no order, and with their arms not ready for use, that Cyrus, Courage, in the midst of such noise and tumult, was scarcely able to form them for battle. Moreover, the very manner in which he led honest men silently and slowly made the Grecians stand amazed at his good discipline, who had expected a regular shouting and leaping, much confusion and separation between one body of men and another. In so vast a multitude of troops, he also placed the choicest of his armed chariots in the front of his own phalanx, over against the Grecian troops, that a violent charge with these might cut open their ranks before they closed with them. But, as this battle is described by many historians, and Xenophon in particular as good as shows it by us by eyesight, not as a past event, but as a present action, and by his vivid account makes his hearers feel all the passion and join in all the dangers of it, it would be folly to me to give any larger account of it than barely to mention any things omitted by him which yet deserve to be recorded. And myth is not supposed to be just something past, but something present with all the feeling and purpose and whatnot. So, the place then in which the two armies were drawn out is called Canaxa, being about 500 furlongs distant from Babylon, and here Clearchus, beseeching Cyrus before the fight to retire behind the combatants and not expose himself to hazard, they say he replied, "What is this, Clearchus? Would ye have me, who aspire to empire, show myself unworthy of it?" But as Cyrus committed a great fault in entering headlong into the midst of danger, and not paying any regard to his own safety, Clearchus was as much to blame, if not more, in refusing to lead the Greeks against the main body of the enemy, where the king stood, and in keeping his right wing close to the river, for fear of being surrounded. For if he wanted, above all other things, to be safe, and considered it his first object to sleep in a whole skin, it had been his best way not to have stirred from home, but after marching in arms 10,000 furlongs from the sea-coast, simply on his choosing, for the purpose of placing Cyrus on the throne, to look about and select a position which would enable him not to preserve him under whose pay and conduct he was, but himself to engage the more ease and security, seemed much like one that through fear of present dangers had abandoned the purpose of his actions, and been false to the design of his expedition, for it is evident from the very event of the battle that none of those who were in array around the king's person could have stood the shock of the Grecian charge, and had they been beaten out of the field, and Artaxerxes either fled or fallen, Cyrus would have gained by the victory, not only by safety, but a crown, and therefore Clearchus, by his caution, must be considered more to blame for the results in the destruction of the life and fortune of Cyrus than he by his heat and rashness. For had the king made it his business to discover a place where, having posted the Grecians, he might encounter them with the least hazard, he would never have found out any other but that which was most remote from himself, and those near him, of his defeat, in which he was insensible. And though Clearchus had the victory, yet Cyrus could not know of it, and could take no advantage of it before his fall. Cyrus knew well enough what was expedient to be done, and commanded Clearchus with his men to take their place in the center. Clearchus replied that he would take care to have all arranged as was best, and then spoiled all. For the Grecians, where they were, defeated the barbarians till they were weary, and chased them successfully a very great way. But Cyrus, being mounted up upon a noble but headstrong and hard-mouthed horse, bearing the name, as Ctesias tells us, of Pasicus, Artaxerxes, the leader of the Cadousians, galloped up to him, crying aloud, O most unjust and senseless of men, who are the disgrace of the honored name of Cyrus, are you come here, leading the wicked Greeks on a wicked journey, to plunder the good things of the Persians, and this with the intent of slaying your lord and brother, the master of 10,000 times 10,000 servants, that are better men than you, as you should see this instant, for ye shall lose your head here before you look upon the face of the king, which, when he had said, cast his javelin at him, but his coat of mail stoutly repelled it, and Cyrus was not wounded, yet the stroke, falling heavily upon him, he reeled under it. Then Artaxerxes, turning his horse, Cyrus threw his weapon, and sent the head of it through the neck near the shoulder bone, so that it was almost universally agreed to by all the authors that Artaxerxes was slain by him. But as to the death of Cyrus, since Xenophon, as being himself no eyewitness of it, has stated it simply and in few words, it may not be amiss perhaps to run over on the one hand what Dryden, and on the other what Ctesias has said of it. Dryden then affirms that, after the death of Artaxerxes, Cyrus, furiously attacking the guard of Artaxerxes, wounded the king's horse, and so dismounted him, and when Teribazus had quickly lifted him up upon another, and said to him, O king, remember this day, which is not to be forgotten, Cyrus, again spurring up his horse, struck down Artaxerxes. But at the third assault, the king being enraged, and saying to those near him that death was more eligible, made up to Cyrus, who furiously and blindly rushed in the face of the weapons opposed to him. So the king struck him with the javelin, and likewise did those that were about him. And thus Cyrus falls, as some say, by the hand of the king, as others by the dart of a carrion, to whom Artaxerxes, for a reward of his achievement, gave the privilege of carrying ever after a golden cock, rooster, upon his spear, before the first ranks of the army in all expeditions. For the Persians call the men of Caria cocks, because of the crests which they adorned their helmets. And one of my ancestral tribes, it appears that their shield was a rooster. So black on red. And there was a naked man, too, like chasing the chicken. I don't know what in the world that's about, but one understands that Family Guy bit when that's when the McFarlane clan shield didn't start as some guy for this will fight. It's like, where's his clothes? It was the naked guy with the chicken at some point. I mean, why? But the account of Ctesias, to put it shortly, omitting many details, is as follows. Cyrus, after the death of Artaxerxes, rode up against the king, as did against him, neither exchanging a word with the other. But Ariaeus, Cyrus's friend, was beforehand with him, and darted first at the king, yet wounded him not. Then the king cast his lance at his brother, but missed him, though he both hit and slew Setitharnes, a nobleman and a faithful friend of Cyrus. Then Cyrus directed his lance at the king, and pierced his breast with it quite through his armor, 2 inches deep, so that he fell from his horse with the stroke, at which, those that attended him being put to flight and disorder, he, rising with a few, amongst whom was Ctesias, and making his way to a little hill not far off, rested himself. But Cyrus, who was in the thick enemy, was carried off a great way by the wildness of his horse, the darkness which was now coming on, making it harder for them to know him, and for his followers to find him. However, being made elate with victory and full of confidence and force, he passed through them, crying out, and that more than once, in the Persian language, "Clear the way, villains, clear the way," which they indeed did, throwing themselves down at his feet. But his tiara dropped off his head, and a young Persian by the name Mithridates, running by, struck a dart into one of his temples near his eye, not knowing who he was, out of which wound much blood gushed, so that Cyrus, swooning and senseless, fell off his horse. Oh, I can't help but think of the King Nothing Metallica song. The horse escaped and ran about the field, but the companion of Mithridates took the trappings which fell off, soaked with blood, as Cyrus slowly began to come to himself. Some eunuchs who were there tried to put him on another horse, and so to convey him safe away, and when he was not able to ride and desired to walk on his feet, they led and supported him, being indeed dizzy in the head and reeling, but convinced of his being victorious, hearing as he went the fugitives saluting Cyrus as king and praying for grace and mercy. In the meantime, some wretched, poverty-stricken Caunians, who, in some pitiful employment as camp followers, had accompanied the king's army, by chances joined these attendants of Cyrus, supposing them to be of their own party. But when, after a while, they made out that their coats over their breastplates were red, whereas all the king's people were white ones, they knew that they were enemies. One of them, therefore, not dreaming that it was Cyrus, ventured to strike him behind with the dart. The vein under the knee was cut open, and Cyrus fell. At the same time struck his wounded temple against a stone, and so died. Thus runs Ctesias' account, tardily, with the slowness of a blunt weapon, effecting the victim's death. When he was now dead, Artaxerxes, the king's eye, passed by on horseback, and having observed the eunuchs lamenting, he asked the most trusty of them, "Who is this Pariscus, whom you sit here deploring?" He replied, "Do not you see, O Artaxerxes, that it is my master Cyrus?" Then Artaxerxes, wondering, bade the eunuch be of good cheer and keep the dead body safe, and going in all haste to Artaxerxes, who had now given up all hope of his affairs, and was in great suffering also with his thirst and his wound, he with much joy assured him that he had seen Cyrus dead. Upon this, at first he set out to go in person to the place, and commanded Artaxerxes to conduct him where he lay. But when there was a great noise made about the Greeks, who were said to be in full pursuit, conquering and carrying all before them, he thought it best to send a number of persons to see. Accordingly, 30 men went with torches in their hands. Meantime, as he seemed to be almost at the point of dying from thirst, his eunuch, Seti Barzanus, ran about, seeking drink for him, for the place had no water in it, and he was at a good distance from his camp. After a long search, he at last met one of those poor Caunian camp followers, who had in a wretched skin about 4 pints of foul and stinking water, which he took and gave to the king. And when he had drunk all off, he asked him if he did not dislike the water. But he declared by all the entities that he worshipped, that he never so much relished either wine or water out of the lightest or purest stream, and therefore said he, if I fail myself to discover and reward him who gave it to you, I beg of heaven, that metanomial reference there, to make him rich and prosperous. Just after this came back the 30 messengers with joy and triumph in their looks, bringing him the tidings of his unexpected fortune. And now he was also encouraged by the number of his soldiers that again began to flock in and gather about him, so that he presently descended into the plain with many lights and flambeaux round about him. And when he had come near the dead body, and according to a certain law of the Persians, the right hand and head had been lopped off from the trunk, he gave orders that the latter should be brought to him, and grasping the hair of it, which was long and bushy, he showed it to those that were still uncertain and disposed to fly. They were amazed at it, and did him homage, so that there were presently 70,000 of them got about him, and entered the camp again with him. He had led out to the fight, as Ctesias affirms, 400,000 men, but Dinon and Xenophon aver that there were many more than 40 myriads actually engaged. As to the number of the slain, as the catalogue of them was given up to Artaxerxes, Ctesias says they were 9,000, but that they appeared to him no fewer than 20,000. Thus far, it is something to be said on both sides, but it is a flagrant untruth on the part of Ctesias to say that he was sent, along with Philinus, the Zacanthian, and some others to the Grecians, for Xenophon knew him well enough that Ctesias was resident at court, for he makes mention of him, and had evidently met with his writings, and therefore he had to come. And, being deputed the interpreter of such momentous words, Xenophon surely would not have struck his name out of the embassy to mention only Philinus, but Ctesias, as is evident, being excessively vainglorious, and no less a favorer of the Lacedaemonians and Clearchus, never fails to assume to himself some province in his narrative, taking opportunity in these situations to introduce abundant high praise of Clearchus and Sparta. When the battle was over, Artaxerxes sent goodly and magnificent gifts to the son of Artaxerxes, whom Carus slew. Kurash. He conferred likewise high honors upon Ctesias and others, and having found that Caunian who gave him the bottle of water, he made him a poor, obscure man, a rich and an honorable person. As for the punishments he inflicted upon delinquents, there was a kind of harmony betwixt them and the crimes. He gave order that one Artaxerxes, a Mede, that had fled in the flight of Cyrus, and again at his fall had come back, he should, as a mark that he was considered a dastardly and effeminate, not a dangerous or treasonable man, have a common harlot set upon his back, and carry her about for a whole day in the marketplace. Another besides, that he had deserted to them, having falsely vaunted that he had killed 2 of the rebels, he decreed that these 3 needles should be struck through his tongue. So that's why you see that this time of year. No, that's not really, but and both supposing that with his own hand he had cut off Cyrus, and being willing that all men should think and say so, he sent rich presents to Mithridates, who first wounded him, and charged those by whom he conveyed the gifts to him to tell him that the king has honored you with these his favors, because you found and brought him the horse trappings of Cyrus, the Carian also, from whose wound in the hand Cyrus died. Suing for his reward, he commanded those that brought it him to say that the king presents you with this as a second remuneration of the good news told him For first Artaxerxes, and next to him you assured him of the deceased of Cyrus. Mithridates retired without complaint, though not without resentment, but the unfortunate Carian was fool enough to give way to natural infirmity, for being ravaged with the sight of the princely gifts that were before him, and being tempted thereupon to challenge and aspire to things above him, he deigned not to accept the king's present as a reward for good news, but indignantly crying out and appealing to witnesses, he protested that he, and none but he, had killed Cyrus, and that he was unjustly deprived of the glory. These words, when they came to his ear, much offended the king, so that forthwith he sentenced him to be beheaded. But the queen mother, being in the king's presence, said, "Let not the king so lightly discharge this pernicious Carian. Let him receive from me the fitting punishment of what he dares to say." So when the king had consigned him over to Artaxerxes, she charged the executioners to take up the man and stretch him upon the rack for 10 days, then tearing out his eyes, to drop molten brass into his ears till he expired. Mithridates also, within a short time after, miserably perished by the like folly, for being invited to a feast where were the eunuchs both of the king and of the queen mother, he came arrayed in the dress and the golden ornaments which he had received from the king. After they began to drink, the eunuch that was the greatest in power with Artaxerxes thus speaks to him: "A magnificent dress indeed, O Mithridates, is this which the king has given you. The chains and bracelets are glorious, and your scimitar of invaluable worth. How happy has he made you, the object of every eye." To whom he, being a little overcome with wine, replied, "What are these things, Sparamizes? Sure I am, I showed myself to the king in that day of trial to be one deserving greater and costlier gifts than these." At which Sparamizes, smiling, said, "I do not grudge them to you, Mithridates, but since the Grecians tell us that wine and truth go together, let me hear now, my friend, what glorious or mighty matter was it to find some trappings that had slipped off a horse, and to bring them to the king." And this he spoke not as ignorant of the truth, but desiring to unbosom him to the company, irritating the vanity of the man, whom drink had now made eager to talk, and incapable of controlling himself. So he forbore nothing, but said out, "Talk you what you please of horse trappings and such trifles. I tell you plainly that this hand was the death of Cyrus, for I threw not my darts as Artaxerxes did, in vain and to no purpose, but only just missing his eye and hitting him right on the temple, and piercing him through, I brought him to the ground, and of that wound he died." The rest of the company, who saw the end and hapless fate of Mithridates as if it were already completed, bowed their heads to the ground, and he who entertained them said, "Mithridates, my friend, let us eat and drink now, revering the fortune of our prince, and let us waive discourse which is too weighty for us." Presently after, Sparamizes told Artaxerxes what he said, and she told the king, who greatly enraged at it, as having the lie given him, and being in danger to forfeit the most glorious and most pleasant circumstance of his victory. For it was his desire that every one, whether Greek or barbarian, should believe that In the mutual assaults and conflicts between him and his brother, he giving and receiving a blow was himself indeed wounded, but that the other lost his life, and therefore he decreed that Mithridates should be put to death in boats, which execution is after the following manner: taking 2 boats framed exactly to fit and answer each other, then laying down in one of them the malefactor that suffers upon his back, then covering it with the other, and so setting them together, that the head, hands, and feet of him are left outside, and the rest of his body lies shut up within. They offer him food, and if he refuses to eat it, they force him to do it by pricking his eyes. Then after he's eaten, they drench him with a mixture of milk and honey, pouring it not only into his mouth, but all over his face. They then keep his face continually turned toward the sun, and it becomes completely covered up and hidden by the multitude of flies that settle on it. And as within the boats, he does what those that eat and drink must needs do: creeping things and vermin spring out of the corruption and rottenness of the excrement, and these entering into the bowels of him, his body is consumed. When the man is manifestly dead, the uppermost boat being taken off, they find his flesh devoured, and swarms of such noisome creatures preying upon, and as it were growing to his inwards. In this way, Mithridates, after suffering for 17 days, at last expired. Messapus, the king's eunuch, who had cut off the hand and head of Cyrus, remained still as a mark for Artaxerxes' vengeance. Whereas, therefore, he was so circumspect that he gave her no advantage against him. She framed this kind of snare for him. She was a very ingenious woman in other ways, and was an excellent player at dice, and before the war had often played with the king. After the war, too, when she had been reconciled to him, she joined readily in all amusements with him, played at dice with him, was his confidant in his love matters, and in every way did her best to leave him as little as possible in the company of Statira, both because she hated her more than any other person, and because she wished to have no one so powerful as herself. And so once, when Artaxerxes was at leisure and inclined to divert himself, she challenged him to play at dice with her for 1,000 darks, and purposely let him win them, and paid him down in gold, yet pretending to be concerned for her loss, and that she would gladly have her revenge for it, she pressed him to begin a new game for a eunuch, to which he consented. But at first they agreed that each of them might accept 5 of the most trusty eunuchs, and that out of the rest of them the loser should yield up any the winner should make choice of. Upon these conditions they played, thus being bent upon her design, and thoroughly in earnest with her game, and the dice also running luckily for her. When she had got the game, she demanded Messapus, who was not in the number of the 5 accepted, and before the king could suspect the matter, having delivered him up to the tormentors, she enjoined them to flay him alive, and to set his body upon 3 stakes, and stretch his skin upon the stakes separately from it. People, was it a torture contest? These things being done, and the king taking them ill, and being incensed against her, she with raillery and laughter told him, "You are a comfortable and happy man indeed, if you are so much disturbed for the sake of an old rascally eunuch, when I, though I've thrown away 1,000 darks, hold my peace, and having acquiesced in my fortune." So the king, vexed with himself, and having been thus deluded, hushed up all, but Statira, both in other matters, openly opposed her, and was angry with her for thus, against all law, and humanity. Sacrificing to the memory of Cyrus, the king's faithful friend and eunuch. Now after that, Tissaphernes had circumvented, and by a false oath had betrayed Arcas and the other commanders, and taking them, he sent them bound in chains to the king. Ctesias says that he was asked by Clearchus to supply him with a comb, and that when he had it, and had combed his head with it, he was much pleased with this good office, and gave him a ring which might be a token of the obligation to his relatives and friends in Sparta, and that the engraving upon this signet was a set of Caratides dancing. He tells us that the soldiers and his fellow captives used to purloin a part of the allowance of food sent to Clearchus, giving him but a little of it, which thing Ctesias says he rectified, causing a better allowance to be conveyed to him, and that a separate share should be distributed to the soldiers by themselves, adding that he ministered to and supplied him thus at interest and at the assistance of Artaxerxes, and there being a portion of ham sent daily with this other food to Arcas, she, he says, advised and instructed him that he ought to bury a small knife in the meat, and thus send it to his friend, and not leave his fate to be determined by the king's cruelty, which he, however, he says, was afraid to do. Rumbling the temple here. However, Artaxerxes consented to the entreaties of his mother, and promised her with an oath that he would spare Arcas. But afterwards, at the instigation of Statira, he put every one of them to death except Memnon. And thenceforward, he says, Artaxerxes watched her advantage against Statira, and made up poison for her. Not a very probable story or a very likely motive to account for her conduct, if indeed he means that out of respect to Clearchus she dared to attempt the life of the lawful queen, that was mother of those that were heirs of the empire. But it is evident enough that this part of the history is a sort of funeral exhibition in honor of Clearchus, for he would have us believe that when the generals were executed, the rest of them were torn in pieces by dogs and birds. But as for the remains of Clearchus, that a violent gust of wind, bearing before it a vast heap of earth, raised a mound to cover his body, upon which, after a short time, some dates having fallen there, a beautiful grove of trees grew up and overshadowed the place, so that the king himself declared his sorrow, concluding that in Clearchus he put to death a man beloved of the entities that they worshipped. Artaxerxes, therefore, having from the first entertained a secret hatred and jealousy against Statira, and seeing that the power she herself had with Artaxerxes was founded upon feelings of honor and respect for her, and that Statira's influence was firmly and strongly based upon love and confidence, was resolved to contrive her ruin, playing at hazard, as she thought, for the greatest stake in the world. Among her attendant women there was one that was trusty and in the highest esteem with her, whose name was Gigis, who, as Dinon avers, assisted in making up the poison. I don't know if you can hear my stomach growl, but at times I certainly do. But Ctesias allows her only to have been conscious of it, and that against her will, charging Bilitaras with actually giving the drug, whereas Dinon says it was Valentus. The two women had begun again to visit each other and to eat together, but though they had thus far relaxed their former habits of jealousy and variance, still out of fear and as a matter of caution, they always ate the same dishes and of the same parts of them. Now there is a small Persian bird in the inside of which no excrement is found, only a mass of fat, so that they suppose the little creatures live upon air and dew. It is called Frontacus. Ctesias affirms that Artaxerxes, cutting a bird of this kind into two pieces with a knife, one side of which had been smeared with the drug, the the other side being clear of it, ate the untouched and wholesome part herself, and gave Statira that which was thus infected. But Dinon would not have it to be Prosatis, but Valentus, that cut up the bird and presented the envenomed part of it to Statira, who, dying with dreadful agonies and convulsions, was herself sensible of what had happened to her, and aroused in the king's mind suspicion of his mother, whose savage and implacable temper he knew, and therefore, proceeding instantly to an inquest, he seized upon his mother's domestic servants that attended at her table, and put them upon the rack. Paracetes kept Gyges at home with her a long time, and though the king commanded her, she would not produce her. But she, at last, herself desiring that she might be dismissed to her own home by night, Artaxerxes had intimation of it, and lying in wait for her, hurried her away, and adjudging her to death. Now poisoners in Persia suffer thus by law. There is a broad stone on which they place the head of the culprit, and then with another stone beat and press it until the face and head itself are pounded to pieces, which was the punishment Gyges lost her life by. But to his mother Artaxerxes neither said nor did any other hurt, save that he banished and confined her, not much against her will, to Babylon, protesting that she, while lived, he would not come near the city. Such was the condition of the king's affairs in his own house.